In the early spring of 1834, somewhere among the soft rolling hills in the center of Virginia, something was uncovered that would forever alter how people think about the darkest places in the human heart. 47 children, ages between 6 and 16, were discovered chained inside a hidden cellar under what looked like a normal country farmhouse. The children did not resemble one another at all, spoke different languages, and when officers tried to question them, they whispered only one name through trembling lips: Mother Sullivan. The sheriff's written account, locked away for more than 100 years in the Henry County archives, described scenes so horrific that 3 of the deputies who had entered the basement quit their positions within days. But what made the case truly terrifying was not only what they found there. It was the realization that Constance Sullivan had been running her terrible operation for over 20 years without anyone noticing. The children called her mother, but the truth behind that word was far more monstrous than anyone could have imagined. Before going deeper into the chilling story of the Sullivan family and the secrets buried under their land, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not meant for everyone. It is only for those brave enough to face the darkest corners of American history. If you are still listening, you are not like most people. You know that some truths are too disturbing to turn away from, even when they shake us to the core. So, hit that subscribe button and join others who seek real mysteries. And tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from? Are you ready to hear stories like this from your own region? The question that haunted investigators then, and still confuses historians today, is how such a huge and terrible operation went unnoticed for so long in a small, tight, rural community. Virginia in 1834 stood at a strange point in time. The old plantation world still controlled much of life, but the first hints of industrial change drifted down from the northern states. In this setting, the farming community of Millbrook, made up of around 50 families spread across the gentle hills of Henry County, represented the typical quiet rural settlement of the era. Most families grew tobacco or corn, bought goods at Henderson's General Store, and met for gatherings at the small one-room schoolhouse that also served as the community's meeting place. The Sullivan property sat just outside this little town, a simple 2-story wooden house surrounded by nearly 200 acres of rich farmland. To anyone traveling the dusty road between Millbrook and Richmond, the Sullivan farm looked entirely ordinary. The house, built in the Federal-style common in the 1810s, had white clapboard siding and a wide porch wrapping around the front. A red barn stood about 60 yards behind the house, with a chicken coop and a smokehouse arranged in a way seen on many farms throughout Virginia. What made the Sullivan land different from every other farm was something no one could see from the road. Ezra Sullivan, who purchased the land in 1809 with money left to him from his father's tobacco business, spent years expanding the basement beneath the house. While most homes in Virginia had only a simple root cellar, the Sullivan basement stretched far beyond the shape of the house above it. Local workers later said they had been hired throughout the 1810s and 1820s to dig out sections, though none ever saw the completed project. Ezra paid in cash and asked only that each man focus on the small section he assigned, rather than trying to understand the entire plan. Constance Sullivan, Ezra's wife, had come to Millbrook in 1811 as a young bride of 22. Neighbors remembered her as a striking woman with dark hair and a quiet, gentle voice. She dressed plainly but neatly, attended services at the Methodist Church when her health allowed, and gained a reputation for kindness and charity. Whenever she was asked to help with local causes, Constance would explain that she and Ezra were already caring for several orphaned children from her family back in Pennsylvania. She always said the arrangement was temporary, only until relatives could find proper homes. This explanation satisfied people and explained the rare glimpses of children around the Sullivan farm. Mrs. Henderson, from the general store, sometimes noticed a young face peeking from the Sullivan wagon when Constance came to buy supplies. The children never spoke, but Constance would tell her they were shy and still shaken by the deaths of their parents. She said they needed time before speaking to strangers. The people of Millbrook, used to the harsh reality of children losing parents in those days, accepted her words without suspicion. Thomas Henderson, who managed the store, later said that Constance was one of his most dependable customers. Every 2 weeks she came with a long list and enough cash to buy large amounts of flour, cornmeal, salt, pork, molasses, and other basics. The amounts seemed high for a couple without children, but when Thomas mentioned this, she reminded him about the orphaned children they were sheltering. She also bought more medicine than most families, simple remedies, fever powders, ointments, explaining that children from poor homes often arrive sick and in need of care. The routine of the Sullivan farm puzzled a few neighbors. While most farms worked from sunrise until nightfall, lights were often seen glowing from the Sullivan farmhouse late into the evening. Sounds of hammering or other construction sometimes echoed across the fields long after other farms had grown quiet. When asked about this, Ezra said he was making improvements to house the growing number of children in their care. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling doctor who visited the region, remembered being called to the Sullivan farm several times during the 1820s and early 1830s. Each time, he was told that one of the children had become ill, yet Constance never allowed the doctor to see any of them in person. She would describe their symptoms and ask for certain medicines. If the doctor insisted on examining them himself, she would explain that the children were terrified of strangers, especially men, because of their painful past. Even the pastor, Reverend Samuel Matthews, believed completely in the Sullivan story. During his visits, he praised Ezra and Constance for taking in so many unfortunate children. He offered to help find permanent homes through church connections, but Constance always said she was already working with relatives in Pennsylvania. She insisted that these matters required time and careful letters. The truth was that Constance Sullivan had been fine-tuning her lies for more than 20 years. The children were not temporary guests waiting for loving families. They were captives, bought, stolen, or tricked from towns across several states, held in conditions so cruel that even hardened criminals would have wept to see them. The beginning of the end came with a chain of small events in the cold months of early 1834. That February was brutally cold, with temperatures staying below freezing for weeks. The harsh winter, though deadly for the trapped children, would end up exposing the Sullivans. On February 23, 1834, a traveling merchant named Jacob Stern was making his way from Richmond to Charlottesville when a fierce snowstorm forced him to look for shelter. The Sullivan farm was the closest building he could see, and with no safe place to continue his journey, he knocked on their door. Ezra, though clearly uneasy, could not refuse shelter during such dangerous weather. Stern later described the night as tense and unsettling. Constance served a simple meal of cornbread and salted pork, but the conversation felt stiff and nervous. The couple kept glancing at each other, jumping slightly at every sound from the wind and the old wooden walls. When Stern asked about the children he had heard they cared for, Constance told him they were asleep and should not be disturbed. She said they had been sick with fever and needed quiet. What troubled Stern more than anything was the noise. Late in the night, as he tried to sleep on a makeshift bed in the Sullivan parlor, he heard what sounded like soft cries rising up from under the floorboards. When he mentioned it to Ezra the next morning, Sullivan insisted it was probably nothing more than the wind slipping through cracks in the old foundation. Noises like that were common in aging houses, he said, especially when the weather turned cold. Stern accepted the explanation at the time, but something in the way Sullivan spoke continued to bother him. The second event took place 3 weeks later, on March 15th. Mary Catherine Flynn, a young Irish immigrant traveling with her family in hopes of finding work in the tobacco fields near Richmond, had become separated from the group while crossing a river. Tired, hungry, and frightened, she wandered toward the Sullivan property as night approached. As darkness settled over the land, Constance Sullivan welcomed her in, offering her a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Mary Catherine was never seen alive again. When her family reached Richmond and reported her missing to the sheriff, they explained where they last saw her and the direction she had been heading. A small search team was put together, but the thick Virginia wilderness made it nearly impossible to locate a single lost person. After a week of looking, the search ended. The general assumption was that Mary Catherine had died from the cold or been taken by wild animals. The final moment that would lead to the awful discovery happened on April. A farmer named William Hutchinson had gone out hunting rabbits in the woods near the Sullivan farm. As he moved quietly through the underbrush, he heard a sound that froze him in place. It came from somewhere around the Sullivan home. It was the noise of children screaming. These were not the typical cries of kids arguing or playing. They were sharp, terrified screams, as though the children were in real danger. Hutchinson moved closer, hiding behind a thick cluster of oak trees about 50 yards from the house. For almost an hour he stayed there, listening and watching. The screams came and went, and he noticed they always seemed to drift up from beneath the house, not from within it. At one point, he saw Ezra Sullivan step out of what looked like a cellar door on the side of the building. Ezra scanned the area nervously before slipping back underground. When Hutchinson shared what he had witnessed with neighbors, opinions were mixed. Some people thought the children the Sullivans had taken in might have deeper problems than the couple had admitted, possibly needing strict discipline or medical attention that could cause distress. Others began recalling small, strange observations that had not seemed important earlier. The large quantities of food Constance Sullivan often bought. The strange noises drifting out at night. The fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen in the town or at any community gatherings. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, an experienced officer who had served Henrico County for over 15 years, dismissed these concerns at first. He believed it was just another round of gossip stirred up by neighbors with too much time on their hands. But when William Hutchinson came to him personally and insisted on making a formal complaint, Crawford decided he had no choice but to look into it. By law, he was required to follow up on reports of suspected mistreatment of children, regardless of what he thought of the people making the accusation. On the morning of April 8, 1834, Sheriff Crawford rode out to the Sullivan farm with his deputy, Marcus Webb. They arrived shortly after sunrise, expecting a simple check that would calm worries in the community. Constance Sullivan greeted them at the front door with an easy smile. She invited them inside for coffee and expressed her distress about the rumors that had been circulating. At first, everything appeared normal. Constance repeated her story about the orphans, showed the officers letters she claimed to have received from relatives in Pennsylvania, and said she could let the sheriff meet the children once they were feeling better from a recent illness. Nothing seemed suspicious until Deputy Webb asked if he could use the privy. As Webb walked around the side of the house, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The cellar door that Hutchinson had reported seeing Ezra use was locked with 3 heavy padlocks. Thick chains wrapped across the handles, and the wood around the door was marked with deep scratches, as though someone inside had clawed at it desperately. When Webb returned inside and quietly told Crawford what he had seen, the sheriff immediately realized this was far more serious than local gossip. Crawford politely asked Constance Sullivan if she would show them the cellar. He explained that a complete inspection would help settle the matter once and for all. The effect on Constance was immediate. Her calm expression drained away. Her face lost its color, her hands quivered, and she began stuttering about the cellar being dangerous, insisting the children were not allowed down there, saying there was nothing inside except old tools and stored goods. Before she could continue her excuses, the 3 of them heard it. From somewhere beneath the floor came the sound of children crying, and then a faint voice calling for help. The sound was soft but unmistakable, rising directly from under the kitchen where they stood. The moments that followed would haunt Sheriff Crawford to the end of his life. He and Deputy Webb forced the cellar door open. A terrible smell washed over them. Human waste, unbathed bodies, and something else Crawford later said was like the very scent of suffering. The basement Ezra Sullivan had spent more than 20 years building was a horrific construction created with careful planning. The main chamber stretched far beyond the foundation of the house, reaching deep into the ground like a hidden maze. Stone walls carefully put together with mortar were arranged to block sound. Several connected rooms formed a complex underground prison. The largest chamber lay directly beneath the kitchen. This was where most of the children were held. They were shackled to iron rings hammered into the stone. Each child had metal restraints around their ankles, with short chains allowing only limited movement. Escape was impossible. The children appeared to be between 6 and 16 years old. They were extremely thin, their clothes nothing more than worn-out scraps. Their bodies showed clear signs of long-term neglect and abuse. Many were sick, coughing, feverish, and suffering from skin infections caused by the cold, wet conditions of the underground rooms. But what struck the officers more deeply than anything was the silence. After the first cries for help, the children said almost nothing. They simply stared at the two men with blank eyes that no longer held hope or even expectation. Deputy Webb, who had 4 children of his own, had to climb out of the basement twice to vomit from shock. Sheriff Crawford, even with all his years of work in law enforcement, found himself unable to grasp the full horror of what he was witnessing. The careful structure of the rooms, the signs of years of planning, the number of victims, it was beyond anything he had ever imagined a person capable of. In smaller connected rooms, the officers found evidence of how the Sullivans controlled their captives. One room contained wooden stocks and other devices used for punishment. Another seemed to be a crude medical area where injuries and illnesses were treated, not out of kindness, but to keep the children alive and able to work. A third room housed detailed written records that would later be crucial to the investigation. These records listed names, ages, dates of arrival, and notes describing each child's behavior and condition. The documents revealed the scale of the operation. Children had been arriving at the farm regularly since 1812, not long after Constance Sullivan arrived in Millbrook. The sources varied. Some children had been brought from overcrowded poorhouses. Others were runaways drawn in by offers of food and shelter. Still others had simply vanished from their families, taken without explanation. The record showed that more than 90 children had been kept in the Sullivan basement over the years. The obvious question, what happened to the others, was answered in the most horrifying manner imaginable. In another chamber, reached by crawling through a narrow passageway, Crawford and Webb found the remains of at least 36 children. Some had died of sickness or lack of food. Others showed marks suggesting they had been harmed before death. All were buried in shallow pits under the dirt floor, with lime scattered over them to keep the smell down. The investigation that followed would continue for many months, as the authorities struggled to understand how such a vast and cruel operation had gone unnoticed for so long. The answer became clearer as they studied the evidence. Constance Sullivan had mastered the art of deception and understood how to use the expectations and beliefs of people around her. She had built a reputation as a charitable, religious woman who cared for orphans, a role that fit perfectly into the values of the community. Her explanation that the children were too scared or too sick to meet strangers seemed believable enough to avoid suspicion. People wanted to believe in her goodness, and that belief allowed her to continue her hidden actions for more than 20 years. Even as neighbors questioned small oddities, her calm smile and gentle manner deflected concern. The community saw what they expected to see, a kind woman helping unfortunate children, and ignored what they did not want to imagine. That combination of charm, lies, and careful planning enabled one of the most disturbing secrets in the region's history to remain buried beneath the ground until the moment it could no longer be hidden. The claim that permanent homes were being arranged with far-off relatives explained why the children never seemed to leave the farm. Even more cleverly, Constance had added several layers of protection around everything she did. The children were trained to call her mother, so if anyone ever heard them talking, it would sound like a normal family setting. On the rare occasions when outsiders caught sight of any of the children, they had been carefully instructed to stay quiet and act timid rather than frightened. The large food orders were excused by saying there were many children to feed, and the steady supply of medical items was justified by claiming the supposed poor health. The physical layout of the whole operation was also planned with great care. The basement structure had been built slowly over many years, with different workers dealing with different parts. No single builder had ever seen the entire space or understood what it was really being used for. The soundproofing worked so well that even people living close by hardly ever heard anything strange, and when they did catch a sound, it could be brushed off as normal farm noises or everyday sounds of children playing. Perhaps the most unsettling part was the psychological system Constance created to keep the children under control. She told them their families had abandoned them, that nobody was searching for them, and that the world outside the farm was dangerous and unfriendly. Children who behaved well were given slightly better food and small comforts. Those who misbehaved were punished in ways that served as warnings to everyone else. As time passed, many of the children accepted their imprisonment as simply the way life was meant to be. When the truth finally came out, the community reacted with complete shock and disbelief. Many local residents refused to accept that Constance Sullivan, the quiet woman who had lived among them for more than 20 years, could be guilty of such terrible acts. Some argued that she must have been forced into it by her husband, while others suggested the whole situation had been misunderstood. These excuses became impossible to maintain as more evidence surfaced. Detailed records found in the basement showed not only information about the children, but also letters exchanged with criminal partners in other states. Constance had been part of a network that dealt in children, buying and selling young victims across state borders. The Sullivan farm turned out to be only one part of a larger criminal system stretching from Pennsylvania down to Georgia. As Sheriff Crawford dug deeper into the Sullivan case, troubling patterns started to appear, suggesting the operation was far more advanced than anyone had expected. The letters discovered in the basement revealed that Constance had been in steady communication with at least a dozen individuals in 5 states, all seemingly involved in similar crimes. These letters, written in a basic code that investigators eventually cracked, discussed deliveries, conditions, and quality control in words that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, written just 3 months before the farm was discovered, came from someone identified only as Morrison in Philadelphia. He wrote that he had 6 new items of different ages and conditions that would suit your needs. The letter described each child, their age, and their physical state. Even more disturbing, it included comments about their personalities, who was obedient, who was difficult, and which children might need extra training. The financial notes were even more horrifying. Constance had been paying between $50 and $200 per child depending on age and condition. She had also been receiving money from other locations, which showed that the Sullivan farm acted as both a receiving point and a distribution point for trafficked children. The total amount of money involved was shocking for that time period. Over $8,000 in transactions across 2 decades, equal to several $100,000 today. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the traveling doctor who had visited the farm several times, became an important witness once the investigation widened. Under questioning, he admitted that Constance had always been unusually detailed about the kinds of medications she wanted. She knew exactly how to treat malnutrition, lung infections, and other illnesses common in children who were severely neglected. She also asked for sedatives and other drugs that could keep difficult prisoners calm. The doctor's testimony led to a chilling realization. Constance had been learning step by step how to keep a large number of children alive under harsh, restrictive conditions. The medical supplies she ordered, the questions she asked, and the very design of the basement all showed one goal: keeping the children alive with as little cost and effort as possible while maintaining complete control. Local shop owner Thomas Henderson added even more pieces to the story. A look at his old sales records showed that Constance had been buying increasing amounts of simple household supplies over the years. What looked like the growing needs of a kind household caring for many children was actually the quiet growth of a criminal enterprise. Henderson also remembered odd requests that had seemed unusual at the time: extra blankets, large bundles of children's clothing, and bulk orders of basic medicines. The investigation also uncovered the role of Ezra Sullivan. While Constance appeared to be the mastermind, Ezra handled the physical upkeep of the hidden prison and dealt with the children directly. Several survivors, once they were finally able to talk, described him as the enforcer, the one who carried out punishments and maintained order. His work on the basement had not just been expanding space. It had been constant adjustments to perfect a system built for holding human beings as captives. The most dreadful discovery came from reviewing the records about children who had disappeared from the Sullivan farm over the years. Some entries showed children who had been transferred to other locations in the network. Others were marked as unsuitable or problematic, notes that matched the remains found buried in the basement chambers. The investigation grew larger as officials in other states began checking their own missing child files. Reports from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, and South Carolina displayed disturbing similarities. Many of the missing children matched the profiles of those found on the Sullivan farm: poor, orphaned, or from families without means to search far or for long. Federal marshals eventually joined the investigation to coordinate the multi-state effort. This was unusual for that era, since most law enforcement acted only within their local areas. The Sullivan case became one of the first major investigations to cross state borders and involve federal authorities. The legal issues were complicated because the crimes took place in different states, each with its own laws. As the weeks went on, more surviving children began sharing their stories. Their accounts were strikingly similar, describing years of captivity, repeated abuse, and deep psychological pressure. They explained how new children were broken in, forced into isolation, punished, and slowly trained until they accepted their new reality. The survivors explained that there was a structured hierarchy inside the basement, with older children given small privileges in exchange for helping control the younger ones. They also revealed the full extent of Constance's psychological manipulation. Many children truly believed their families had abandoned them or sold them, and that they deserved the treatment they received. Some of the older children, after being held for years, even resisted being rescued at first, convinced by Constance that the outside world was far more dangerous than the farm. The investigation uncovered how Constance found her victims. She had built quiet relationships with corrupt officials at poorhouses and orphanages who would give her children in return for payment. She also built ties with criminals in large cities who identified vulnerable children, runaways, street kids, or any child who might not be reported missing right away. Most chilling of all, the record showed that the Sullivan operation had been expanding. More children were being brought in, and the correspondence mentioned plans to set up similar hidden facilities in other areas. The discovery of the Sullivan farm happened just as the criminal network appeared to be preparing for much larger operations. The turning point that finally led to the full uncovering of the Sullivan network came from a place no one had expected. Among the children who had survived, there was a girl named Rebecca, around 14 years old, who had been kept far longer than any of the others. Many of the children had been so deeply harmed by their time in the Sullivan cellar that they could barely speak or remember details, but Rebecca was different. She had held on to a small but powerful spark of determination. What made her even more unusual was her sharp memory. She had been taken from her family's Pennsylvania farm in 1829, when she had been only 9 years old, and she remembered nearly every moment. She remembered the woman who'd come to their farm pretending to be a distant cousin. She recalled how that woman had spoken kindly, offering her treats and promising a ride into town. She remembered how she had trusted her, how she had climbed into the wagon, and how everything had changed once she woke up chained inside the Sullivan basement. But even more important than these painful memories were the countless conversations she had overheard while being kept on the farm. Rebecca had listened carefully whenever Constance Sullivan or the various visitors spoke. Over the years she had gathered information, piece by piece, name by name, until she unknowingly held more knowledge of the entire. Her testimony was the first thing that gave law enforcement a real sense of the size of the criminal system behind the Sullivan farm. She spoke of other farms, other holding places, and other groups of children who had been taken, moved, and traded. She remembered names, locations, times, and the movement of these children between different secret sites. For the first time, investigators could see that the Sullivan operation was only one branch of a much larger network that reached farther than anyone had imagined. The most shocking detail came when Rebecca described something that had happened just 2 weeks before the farm had been discovered. A well-dressed man had arrived in a polished carriage, accompanied by 2 other men who looked like hired assistants. Rebecca had been taken from her cell along with 3 other children because the visitors wanted to inspect them. She described how the man examined them, checking their teeth, looking at their arms and legs, judging their health as if he were evaluating farm animals instead of human children. In the end, he did not take any of them. He had said they were too damaged for what he needed, but before leaving, he handed Constance Sullivan a letter. That letter, found later among her papers, listed exactly what kinds of children he wanted to buy. The note was cold, direct, and written in the language of business. There was no compassion in it at all. It listed ages, body types, and personality traits as if ordering supplies. At the bottom was a signature, H. Blackwood. The letter also gave a return address in Charleston, South Carolina. Once the authorities followed that lead, they learned that Henry Blackwood was a wealthy plantation owner. On the surface, he claimed he was buying children to serve as household workers. But when investigators looked deeper, they discovered his true purpose, one far worse than what had been happening at the Sullivan farm. This connection to Blackwood opened a completely new chapter in the case. It seemed that several southern plantation owners had been using the trafficking network to obtain children who would have no legal identity and no protectors. Unlike enslaved adults, who at least had some recognition under the law and whose absence might be noticed, these trafficked children could be exploited in complete secrecy. No relatives would come searching, and the law offered them no protection at all. Investigators soon discovered that the children sent to these plantations were used not only for harsh labor, some were used in experiments or for violent amusements, and some were subjected to other acts so cruel that officers chose not to record every detail. As the connections spread, it became clear that several wealthy families were involved. They had money, political influence, and a deep interest in keeping the truth hidden. Resistance to the investigation grew quickly. People with power did not want their names exposed. Threats began almost immediately. Sheriff Crawford received letters warning him to abandon the case. Deputy Webb was jumped by unknown attackers while walking home. Dr. Whitfield, who had examined the surviving children, suddenly found several important clients refusing to visit his practice. Their pressure was clear. They wanted the investigation stopped. The case grew even more terrifying when one of the surviving children, a boy named Timothy, who had been helping the investigators, disappeared from the shelter where he had been placed. A frantic search followed, but he was never found. The message was unmistakable. Anyone who helped expose the network could meet the same fate. Even with all the danger, the investigation pressed forward. Federal marshals were sent in to guard key people. The children who had survived were moved to secure locations where round-the-clock protection was provided. The Sullivan farm itself was watched at all hours to keep evidence from being destroyed or stolen. The case had grown into a test of whether the country's legal system could function when the accused were among the richest and most connected people in the country. Then came the worst blow yet. Constance Sullivan was found dead in her jail cell. The official statement claimed she had taken her own life, but almost no one believed that explanation. She had been scheduled to speak publicly about her role and about the people above her in the network, buyers, organizers, financiers, and others. Her death erased the testimony that could have revealed the final structure of the entire criminal ring. Her sudden death sent waves of fear through the whole investigative team. If someone had enough power to silence her inside a secure jail, then anyone else connected to the case could be in danger as well. The investigators were beginning to understand that they were not dealing simply with criminals, but with an organized enterprise that reached into some of the most respected parts of American society. Just as the case seemed ready to collapse under pressure, something unexpected happened. A man named Samuel Pierce, once an employee of Henry Blackwood, stepped forward. He carried a deep sense of guilt for what he had seen over the years. After hearing about the discovery of the Sullivan children, he could no longer keep silent. Pierce had been an overseer on the Blackwood plantation and had direct knowledge of the children Blackwood had purchased from the network. He also had documents, records that linked Blackwood directly to the Sullivan farm and to other buyers. His testimony would later be remembered as one of the most disturbing in American legal history. Pierce was in his 40s, with rough hands and a tired face that showed years of quiet suffering. For more than a decade he had worked on the Blackwood plantation, and what he had witnessed had haunted him ever since. When he took the stand before the federal grand jury in Richmond, the courtroom was silent. He explained that the plantation had two separate worlds. The first was the main plantation, where enslaved workers produced cotton in the usual, though harsh, manner. The second was a place he called the experimental quarters. Here, the trafficked children were kept, not for farm labor, but for other purposes. According to Pierce, Blackwood and a few of his associates, among them 2 doctors from Charleston Medical College, used the children for medical experiments. Their goal was to test limits of human endurance, observe the effects of different substances, and satisfy what they claimed was scientific curiosity. To them, the children were not seen as children at all. Pierce revealed that Blackwood kept extremely detailed notes. He wrote down how each child responded to the tests, how long they survived under various conditions, and what happened when certain illnesses were deliberately introduced. These records showed that the so-called research was, in reality, long-term torture disguised as science. Pierce testified that at least 37 children from the Sullivan network had been sold to Blackwood. Of those, only 4 survived long enough to be sold again. The rest died from sickness, mistreatment, or sheer exhaustion. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves far from the main house, in a wooded area that few people visited. He also told investigators that Blackwood had been part of an even wider group of buyers. Pierce had been present during gatherings where Blackwood discussed acquiring more children with other plantation owners, businessmen, and even men who held political office. What he shared painted a picture of a network so large and so deeply rooted that the investigators finally understood the true danger they were facing. The conversations he overheard made it clear that the trafficking network reached far beyond anything investigators had imagined. Children were being bought and sold throughout the entire country, with different buyers seeking different qualities and purposes. The most shocking moment came when Pierce described a gathering he had seen in the autumn of 1833. Blackwood had hosted what he called a demonstration for potential buyers from all over the South. The event was meant to show the supposed value of the children offered by the network and to display the many ways they could be used. Pierce's description of this gathering was so disturbing that several grand jury members had to leave the room. The demonstration included displays of the children's ability to do various kinds of work, their reactions to different methods of punishment and control, and their supposed suitability for different types of exploitation. Buyers were encouraged to closely inspect the children, to test their responses, and to place orders for specific kinds of victims. The entire event had the cold, businesslike atmosphere of a livestock auction. Pierce's testimony also revealed the financial scale of the operation. The prices paid for children varied widely, depending on age, physical condition, and the intended purpose. Younger children who were easier to control and mold were sold for higher amounts. Children with particular physical traits or special abilities were priced even higher. The total money involved in the trafficking ring was estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, which was an enormous sum for that era. Investigators used Pierce's information to coordinate raids on several locations across the South. Federal marshals, working with local law enforcement, struck simultaneously at plantations, storage sites, and other facilities where trafficked children were kept. The raids were carried out in complete secrecy to avoid the destruction of evidence, and the results of these coordinated raids were overwhelming. More than 100 additional children were rescued from different locations. Investigators collected physical evidence that showed the entire reach of the trafficking network, including financial records, letters, and detailed ledgers of purchases and sales. Several well-known individuals were arrested, including Henry Blackwood, 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, and a Georgia state legislator who had been one of the network's most frequent clients. The evidence collected during the raids revealed a level of organized cruelty that shocked the entire nation. The network had been operating for more than 30 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had harmed hundreds of children. The organization and careful planning of the ring were unlike anything known in criminal activity of that time. The medical experiments carried out by Blackwood and his partners were recorded in horrifying detail. Documents showed that the experimenters had intentionally infected children with diseases to study their progression, tested different poisons and chemicals, and performed surgeries without anesthesia or proper medical skill. The children were treated as disposable test subjects, their lives valued only for whatever scientific information could be gained from their pain. The investigation also uncovered the corruption that allowed the network to exist for so long. Officials at orphanages, poorhouses, and local governments had been bribed to supply children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or to approve adoptions that were actually illegal sales. Even some law enforcement officers had been involved in hiding evidence and scaring away witnesses. The legal cases that followed dragged on for years as prosecutors tried to bring justice to victims of crimes spread across many states and legal boundaries. The complexity of the case, along with the wealth and strong political ties of many of the accused, made prosecution extremely difficult. Several important suspects escaped conviction through legal loopholes or by using their influence with powerful allies. Still, the public exposure of the trafficking network had huge effects that reached far beyond the courtrooms. The Sullivan case became the driving force for the first federal laws addressing child trafficking and abuse. It led to major improvements in the oversight of orphanages and poor houses and brought new legal protections for children at risk. The final conclusion of the Sullivan case took nearly 5 years, but its impact on American society was immediate and long-lasting. The public reaction was one of horrified fascination, mixed with a strong desire to make sure such crimes never happened again. Newspapers across the country published the story in great detail, with some dedicating entire issues to explaining the investigators' discoveries. The surviving children faced a long and painful road toward healing. Many had been held captive for years and had almost no memory of life before their suffering began. The 47 children rescued from the Sullivan basement needed extensive medical care, psychological treatment, and slow, careful guidance to help them return to normal human interactions. Many never fully recovered, carrying emotional and physical scars for the rest of their lives. Rebecca, the 14-year-old girl whose testimony had been essential in exposing the wider network, became a kind of public hero as news of her bravery spread. But the attention soon became too much for someone who had gone through such terrible trauma. She was eventually placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania who offered her the calm, supportive home she needed. Rebecca lived to the age of 73, later marrying and raising her own family. However, she never again spoke publicly about what she had experienced after giving her testimony at the trial. The legal cases also revealed the full extent of the corruption that had protected the trafficking network. Ezra Sullivan, who had been arrested during the first raid, was convicted of several counts including kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Richmond on November 15, 1836, before a crowd of more than 3,000 people. Witnesses said his last words were a confession that he had followed a path of evil and a plea for forgiveness from the children he had helped torture. Henry Blackwood's trial became a national sensation that exposed the dark, hidden side of Southern plantation society. The medical records taken from his plantation were proof of organized torture and murder that shocked even experienced investigators. Blackwood was found guilty of several murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years due to appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1841, officially from a heart attack, though some believed he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal more secrets. The 2 doctors from Charleston Medical College who took part in the experiments were removed from the medical profession and sentenced to long prison terms. Their trials led to new rules for medical research and the treatment of human subjects. The medical college itself faced a scandal so serious that it almost shut down, as investigators found that several other faculty members knew about the illegal experiments but had stayed silent. One of the most frustrating parts of the investigation was the number of powerful people who escaped justice even though there was strong evidence of their involvement. Some wealthy plantation owners fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political power to avoid prosecution or to secure light sentences that did not match the severity of their crimes. A Georgia state legislator who had been one of the network's biggest customers was formally reprimanded by his legislature but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation showed that the trafficking ring had brought in enormous profits for its leaders. Constance Sullivan alone had earned more than $12,000 during her 20 years in the operation, an amount equal to several $100,000 in today's money. Much of the money was never recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators could not trace. The Sullivan farm became a symbol of the horrors uncovered during the investigation. The government seized the property and later sold it at auction, but no one wanted to live on land connected with such terrible acts. The house was torn down in 1845, and the basement was filled with concrete and permanently sealed. A small cemetery was created on the site to honor the children who had died there, though most of their names were never known. The case led to important changes in child welfare and protection laws, and brought much-needed attention to the treatment of vulnerable children across the nation. Virginia passed the first broad child protection laws in American history, creating government supervision of orphanages and requiring background checks for anyone wanting to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states soon followed with similar rules, forming the earliest framework of what would later become modern child welfare systems. The federal government also acted by creating new laws to address crimes that crossed state borders, including human trafficking. The Sullivan case had shown the weakness of relying only on state-level enforcement when criminals operated across different states. New federal laws gave marshals wider authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, setting legal precedents that would become extremely important in later developments of the justice system. Perhaps even more importantly, the case changed how the public understood the vulnerability of children and the need for structured protection. The earlier idea of a kind person taking in abandoned children out of charity was replaced by a clearer understanding that proper oversight and legal safeguards were necessary. The phrase, "another Sullivan case," entered everyday language as a warning about how easily abuse could happen when vulnerable children were involved. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the physician who had unknowingly helped the Sullivan operation through his medical evaluations, devoted the rest of his life to child welfare. He opened free clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children, and became a strong supporter of reforms in medical practice that would prevent doctors from being tricked or used by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were deeply shaped by what he had learned from the Sullivan case. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, who had led the early investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career working on similar crimes. He became one of the first law enforcement officers to focus on crimes involving children, creating investigative methods and procedures that continued to influence police work for decades. Crawford's detailed reports on the Sullivan case became required reading for officers across the country. The children's stories, as they slowly came to light over the years, showed the full strength of human endurance and the long-term damage caused by sustained abuse. Some, like Rebecca, were able to build fairly stable lives with strong support, patience, and care. Others dealt with lifelong mental struggles, addiction, and other issues rooted in the trauma they had endured. A few never recovered at all, passing away young because of health problems connected to their imprisonment. The network's letters and papers, which had been kept as evidence, gave investigators information that led to more cases long after the original discovery. Letters found in the Sullivan basement mentioned other operations, other children, and other criminals. Some of these leads brought successful prosecutions, while others went nowhere or involved crimes too old to prove with enough evidence. One of the most haunting realizations of the entire case was that the Sullivan operation was only one piece of a much larger system of exploitation that had gone unnoticed for decades. The investigation revealed that similar networks had existed in other parts of the country, that children had been treated like goods to be bought and sold throughout parts of American history, and that both legal and social systems had failed to protect the most defenseless people in society. The case also revealed the importance of community responsibility in preventing such horrors. The people of Millbrook, who had lived for 20 years next to one of the worst crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and self-reflection. How had they missed what was happening? What signs had they ignored? Could the suffering have been stopped if they had been more alert or less trusting? These questions led to broader discussions about a community's duty to watch over its most vulnerable members. The Sullivan case became a warning about the dangers of accepting easy explanations without looking deeper, of respecting privacy when that privacy allowed abuse to continue unchecked, and of assuming that people with respectable reputations were always honorable. The legacy of the Sullivan case reached far beyond the immediate legal changes it brought. The extensive records of the investigation, including letters, financial logs, and testimony, became a valuable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in the United States. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers studied the case for generations, using it to understand how organized cruelty could grow quietly within communities that seemed ordinary on the surface. In the end, the Sullivan family's long reign of terror was stopped not by advanced police technology or modern investigative tools, but by the courage of regular people who refused to ignore what was right in front of them. William Hutchinson's choice to report what he had overheard, Sheriff Crawford's willingness to take community fears seriously, and Rebecca's bravery in testifying despite her deep trauma, these individual acts of moral bravery were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrifying criminal networks in American history. The basement where 47 children were found chained has been sealed for more than a century, yet the memory of their suffering remains, reminding us of the need for constant watchfulness, bravery, and compassion in protecting those who cannot defend themselves. The Sullivan case stands as proof of the depths of human cruelty, but also as a reminder that individual conscience can break even the most deeply rooted systems of exploitation. If this story has sent chills down your spine, it shows why these dark chapters of American history must never disappear from memory. Just when we think we've heard the worst, the horror uncovered at places like the Sullivan Farm expands our understanding of how evil can hide behind polite manners and respectable appearances. If this story unsettles you, share it with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and make sure you subscribe so you never miss more stories like this. Together, let's keep exploring what other secrets lie hidden in America's past. This tale reminds us that evil often wears a mask of respectability, and that the most shocking crimes can be committed by people who appear completely normal to those around them. What do you think about this story? Do you believe everything was uncovered, or are there still secrets buried in the hills of Virginia? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of horror and mystery, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share with someone who loves chilling stories. The darker corners of American history hold many more secrets, and we'll be here to reveal them one by one.